Hello, good morning. I would like to read today a little from Tracing Orkneys Origins by Laird Scranton, and I will put a link to his book down in the description because this is a fabulous tome. I'd like to read an excerpt from chapter 6, Symbolic Reversal. In previous volumes of this series, we have suggested that symbolism is the effective language of the ancient cosmological tradition. However, in order to fully grasp that idea, we first need to understand what constitutes a symbol from the perspective of that same cosmology. Stated most simply, a symbol is taken to be any action, object, or representation capable of preserving and later correctly replicating knowledge. Consequently, a symbol has two distinct aspects to it: that of the person who initially associates meaning with the symbol, and that of the person who later perceives that association. The outlook of these dual perspectives is upheld by two ancient Egyptian words for, quote, symbol, unquote, which reflect these same two considerations. The first of these words is Hashem, whose glyphs read action, preserves knowledge. The second is the word Akam, which reads action, replicates knowledge. Although modern words of the English language largely do not convey symbolism, working from these definitions we can cite familiar examples of symbols that do play a familiar role in everyday life. For instance, when driving a car, a left turn arrow is an example of a symbol, in that it relays the message to the driver that turning to the left is allowed, disallowed, or required. A national flag is a symbol in that it signifies a specific country, and an index finger held vertically to the lips is a symbolic act, since it communicates the desire that a person remains silent. For a symbol or symbolic act to be most effective, it needs to intuitively reflect the idea that is assigned to it. In order to do that well, both the symbol and its associated meaning should resonate with the person who is expected to interpret it. To the extent that ancient symbolism is rooted in themes of creation, notably how the universe formed, how matter forms, and how biological creation comes about. Many of the ancient symbols also specifically reflect concepts of creation. From the perspective of the previously mentioned ancient cosmological philosophy of Samkhya, foundational processes of material creation, those which govern our material universe and the formation of matter, depend on a cyclical flow of energy and mass between our familiar material universe and a non-material companion universe. The Dogon compare that flow to the natural water cycle, which we all know is essential to the existence of life on Earth, the natural cycle in which the sea water evaporates to form clouds and then produce rain that ultimately flows back to the sea again. Perhaps the most familiar expression of the cosmological circuit of energy between the universes is found in the Hindu and Buddhist concept of the Yuga cycle, where it closely associates with an apparent rotation of the constellation of stars known as the precession of the equinoxes, one that requires some 26,920 years to return to its starting point. In ancient Kabbalism, the cycle of scrolling energy is specifically symbolized by a traditional Torah scroll, which, throughout the year in a Jewish temple is progressively scrolled from one spindle to the other, then rewound to begin again. In that mode of understanding, the energetic cycle is characterized metaphorically as a primordial scroll, because ultimately it is both energy and mass that flows between universes. The effect is comparable to that of sand shifting between the two globes of an hourglass. The period of the Yuga is conceptualized in two half cycles, one termed ascending, the other descending. In the traditional view, humanity is understood to have recently completed the descending half of a cycle. Over the course of each half cycle of the energy flow, one universe grows progressively less massive, while the other becomes comparably more massive. So while we may think of these universes in absolutes as, quote, non-material, unquote, and, quote, material, unquote, based on the nature of the interaction, we might more accurately describe them as, quote, less material, unquote, and, quote, more material, unquote. The dynamic implies that midway through the cycle, when the transfer passes the midpoint of the flow, the masses of the two vessels equalize. The roles of the two universes reverse. The one that we had previously seen as less material then becomes the more material of the two universes. Another way of looking at this cycle of energy and mass is to compare it to the familiar cycle of a year. In fact, the Hindu-Buddhist concept of the Yuga cycle is alternately conceptualized as a great year. By that metaphor, the midpoint of the flow of energy would correspond to the equinox of a year, while the two extremes extent of the flow compare to the two solstices. For this reason, the familiar points of solar transition that we experience annually relate to the points of energetic transition for the two universes. We can infer that it is for the same reason that these transition points, which may not be outwardly evident to the average person, became emphasized as holidays in various religious traditions. We have said that the ancient cosmological tradition represents concepts such as the dynamic of the flow of energy between two universes metaphorically. By one mode of expression, the non-material universe is treated as feminine, while its material companion is masculine. By another, the non-material domain represents unity, while the material domain corresponds to multiplicity. In keeping with those metaphors, a geometric circle, which is a singular figure, comes to represent the unity of the non-material realm, while a square, in brackets, a four-sided figure, represents the material realm, which we understand to be four-dimensional. In the context of a cycle of time, we could think of these metaphoric references as relative designations, similar to the concept of AM and PM in relation to time of day. In the proper designation is one that shifts as the day progresses. As people of a modern world closely regulated by time, we understand that the designation AM only applies to the hours after midnight and before noon. We learn to reflexively flip the designation to PM when the hour of the day passes noon. Then switch it back again when the hour passes midnight. Cultures who were schooled in the great year mindset of the ancient cosmology similarly understood the equinoctial point of the great year as the line of demarcation for a universe between its less material and more material statuses. Because of that, ancient cultures also knew to essentially flip AM to PM, symbolically speaking, once that line of demarcation had been crossed. And so, In keeping with that outlook, symbolic structures that, beginning in archaic times, had long been built with a circular base, in brackets, appropriate to our universe's less material status. In later eras came to be squared. Goddesses that had originally been emphasized in ancient matriarchal cultures, in brackets appropriate to feminine non-materiality, were eventually supplanted by patriarchal gods, often assigned effectively the same name and otherwise matching attributes. It is for these same reasons that shrines and sacred sites were routinely aligned to the equinoxes and solstices, in part as a way to give visibility to those events. Those aspects of ancient culture tied to the cycle of energy were observed worldwide, and so cultures across the globe made a transition from matriarchy to patriarchy in approximately the same era. Likewise, we document a wide range of religions globally whose key celebrations are timed to transits of the sun at those equinoxes and solstices, despite the fact that those calendrical points are neither immediately observable by the average person nor easily calculated. For the Buddhists, the Islamists and the Dogon, in brackets among others, the geometry by which traditional shrines were aligned, often along with the alignments themselves, gave ancient observers visibility on these events, and so the suggestion is that any ancient religion whose celebrations corresponded to those alignments were assisted by that same geometry. When considering a cosmological rotation with a roughly 13,000-year half cycle, and whose first evidence for our purposes appears at around 10,000 BCE, in brackets call that the northern solstice of the great year, then simple math suggests that we would pass the midpoint of the cycles of energy some 6,500 years later, sometime after 3,500 BCE. This is the era of the establishment of the Hebrew calendar. It is precisely the era in which we see pertinent symbolic elements begin to reverse themselves in widely distant cultures worldwide. Awareness of these reversals provides a basis to infer that the Dogon granary shrine, which in many ways is a structural and symbolic match for a Buddhist stupa, is likely to represent an archaic form, since its architecture associates a round base with the earth. Meanwhile, we assign a traditional stupa as architecture from a later ancient era, when a square base would properly apply to the concept of earth. Great attention is paid within the ancient cosmology to understand the nature of this flow of energy between universes and how non-material and material energies come together. So, the idea comes to be expressed in many different metaphoric ways. Symbolism that associates the figure of a circle with the non-material domain and the square with the material domain is geometric. However, we can also understand the figures in terms of dimensionality. Since a circle is a figure comprised of one side, consistent with a notion of unity, that numerically suggests one dimensionality. Meanwhile, a square has four sides, numerically suggestive of 4 dimensions. This seems appropriate, since we have said that the symbolic cosmology treats an oscillation of time, which looks to us like unity, as the first of 4 dimensions, and our everyday reality as 4-dimensional. Based on the symbolic assignments of these geometric figures, we can understand the notion of squaring a circle, a symbolic way of reconciling non-materiality with materiality. Similarly, in many ancient cultures, the cycle of the solar year began with the heliacal rising of Sirius, in brackets, symbolic of the non-material domain. As the star moves into visibility in proximity to the sun, this occurs following a period of days during which Sirius has been invisible to us because our view of it has been masked by the glare of the sun. Much as, from the perspective of the Yuga cycle, over time humanity comes to be distanced from any direct perception of non-materiality. Again, observance of the heliacal rising of Sirius reflects a metaphor for non-materiality coming back into alignment once more with materiality. Knowing that cosmological symbolism seems to have been expressed through architectural forms since the earliest days of the tradition, where there is evidence of that symbolic tradition, we can often use structural features to infer the relative era in which certain edifices are likely to have been set in place. From that perspective, the form of a round-based Dogon-style stupa likely dates to the early half of the last descending cycle, or sometime prior to 3500 BCE. Similarly, it may be reasonable to infer that square-based pyramids, such as the Great Pyramid at Giza, were constructed during the latter half of a descending half-cycle of the Great Year. In brackets, such structures would be appropriate to the first half of the previous ascending half-cycle. Moreover, the outright absence of carved inscriptions within the Great Pyramid might reasonably imply that construction occurred prior to the advent of written language. If we adopt these factors as constraints, then the likely suggestion is that the Great Pyramid, if built during this energetic half-cycle, may have been initiated sometime following the midpoint of the descending half-cycle, 3600 BCE, but before the onset of written language, circa 2900 BCE. This circumstance of reversal in the geometric form of ancient structures is not one that is limited to cultures in the Near East, India, Egypt, or Africa. In fact, the pagan religions of the ancient British Isles, British historian Ronald Hutton notes a change in the base configuration of huts in the British Isles from circular to square that came about during the Neolithic era. Looking in terms of symbolic reversals, we understand why themes, actions, and events that were assigned to goddesses in the early eras of cosmology often played out in relation to gods during later eras. In Decoding Maori Cosmology, we cited examples in which outwardly feminine terms, attributes, and actions were inextricably applied to male gods in Maori myths, a circumstance which suggests that at some point in the tradition the gender of certain characters within the myth was seemingly recast. Symbolism is treated as the root mode of expression for the ancient creation tradition, one that makes its appearance in the Archaic Age, then comes to be supplanted by written language midway through the tradition. Thus, it is fair, based on both effect and timing, to interpret the tradition from an oral to a written tradition as another example of symbolic reversal. In keeping with this, the non-material domain is often associated with conscious thought, expressed symbolically, while the material domain is defined by spoken words. In fact, in contexts like the biblical book of Genesis, the very act of speaking a word becomes a metaphor for the process of material creation. Groups such as the Dogon, who preserve an archaic outlook on the symbolic cosmology, take a disparaging view of written language and consider it to be a medium for the ultimate degradation of knowledge. As they see things, any astute student should hope to take instruction directly from an adept, an expert who commands an overview of whatever skill or intellectual endeavour the student hopes to master, not from written statements. Writing is viewed as a system of representation that makes it possible for a person who has not truly mastered a subject to give the appearance that they have. The true path to the acquisition of knowledge lies in close personal association with an expert who demonstrates command of such knowledge in its entirety. We see similar influence of symbolic reversal reflected in the burial traditions of ancient cultures, and we again recognise and correlate these based on a cluster of defining features. The practice is perhaps best documented in relation to the Sakti cult, where in ancient times the skull of a deceased person was opened at the crown as a way to allow the soul of the person to ascend. The head was separated from the skeleton, the bones decimated and sometimes burned, then deposited in a chamber as part of a group burial. By the era of ancient Egypt, the body of the deceased was wrapped in a spiral of cloth and the mouth opened to allow the soul of the person to be, in quote, spoken, unquote, or reborn materially. The Egyptian term for the ritual up-array was written with two glyphs. The first is an upward extending pair of horns, which Budge says represents, quote, the crown of the head, unquote. We understand the figure to also be symbolic of the concept of ascension. The second glyph of the word is the Egyptian mouth glyph, the mouth glyph which takes the same shape as the Vesica Piscis, corresponds in Dogon cosmology to a quantum scale, energetic gateway between the non-material and material domains, one that ostensibly exists at every point in space and time, and so constitutes the entry point to the processes of material creation. Based on the glyphs, we can say that both the archaic and later ancient aspects of the burial ritual are reflected in the form of the word. Based on this, the clustered elements of the archaic group burial practice can be seen as one of the signatures of the cosmological tradition, an observation that allows us to infer the influence of the cosmology in any ancient culture that observed it. It may be significant to note that key elements of the Tomb of the Eagle's burial tradition were also evident during a transitional era of ancient Egypt. Sir E.A. Wallace Budge recognises burial practices that he assigns to three different eras. Of the second of those eras, he writes in his book, Egyptian Religion, quote, "In the second, oldest graves, the bodies are found to have been wholly or partly stripped of their flesh. In the former case, all the bones are found cast indiscriminately in the grave. In certain graves, it is clear that the body has been burnt," unquote. In short, there is evidence from pre-dynastic Egypt of the same Near East burial tradition that we also observe practiced in Neolithic Orkney. I hope you enjoyed that little excerpt, and that you will go to the link below and purchase a copy of Laird Scranton's book, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.